Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm Shalinda, and on this podcast, we bring legends back to life. We're going to continue a little bit more the story of Pixar and Toy Story and the premiere and its initial launch. There were two premieres of Toy Story in November 1995. Disney organized one at El Capitan, a grand old theater in Los Angeles, and built a funhouse next door featuring the characters. Pixar was given a handful of passes, but the evening and its celebrity guest list were very much a Disney production. Jobs did not even attend. Instead, the next night he rented the Regency, a similar theater in San Francisco, and held his own premiere. Instead of Tom Hanks and Tim Allen, the guests were Silicon Valley celebrities such as Larry Ellison and Andy Grove. This was clearly Jobs' show. He, not Lasseter, took to the stage to introduce the movie. The dueling premieres highlighted a festering issue. Was Toy Story a Disney or a Pixar movie? Or was Disney merely a distributor and marketer helping Pixar roll out its movies? The answer was somewhere in between. The question would be whether the egos involved, mainly those of Michael Eisner and Steve Jobs, could get on such a partnership. The stakes were raised when Toy Story opened to a blockbuster commercial and critical success. It recouped its cost the first weekend with a domestic opening of $30 million, and it went on to become the top-grossing film of the year, beating Batman Forever and Apollo 13 with $192 million in receipt domestically and a total of $362 million worldwide. According to the review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, 100% of the 73 critics surveyed gave it a positive review. Times Richard Corliss called it the year's most inventive comedy. David Ansen of Newsweek pronounced it a marvel, and Jane Maslin of the New York Times recommended it to both children and adults as a work of incredible cleverness in the best two-tier Disney tradition. The only rub for Jobs was that reviewers such as Maslin wrote of the Disney tradition, not the emergence of Pixar. After reading her review, he decided he had to go on the offensive to raise Pixar's profile. When he and Lasseter went on the Charlie Rose show, he emphasized that Toy Story was a Pixar movie, and he even tried to highlight the historic nature of a new studio being born. Jobs came to the conclusion that the fundamental issue, whose movie was it, would have to be settled contractually rather than by a war of words. After Toy Story's success, he said, "I realized that we needed to cut a new deal with Disney if we were ever to build a studio and not just be a work-for-hire place. But in order to sit down with Disney on equal basis, Pixar had to bring something to the table. That required a successful IPO." The public offering occurred exactly 1 week after Toy Story's opening. Jobs had gambled that the movie would be successful, and the risky bet paid off, big time. As with the Apple IPO, a celebration was planned at the San Francisco office when the shares were to go on sale. The plan had originally been for the first shares to be offered at about $14 to be sure they would sell. Jobs insisted on pricing them at $22, which would give the company more money if the offering was a success. It was, beyond even his wildest dreams. It exceeded Netscape as the biggest IPO of the year. In the first half hour, the stock shot up to $45, and trading had to be delayed because there were so many orders. And then went up even further to $49 before settling back down to a close of the day at $39. Earlier that year, Jobs had been hoping to find a buyer for Pixar that would let him merely recoup the $50 million he had put in. By the end of the day, the shares he had retained, 80% of the company, were worth more than 20 times that, an astonishing $1.2 billion. That was about 5 times what he had made at Apple when Apple went public in 1980. But Jobs told John Markoff of the New York Times that the money did not mean much to him. "There's no yacht in my future," he said. "I've never done this for the money." The successful IPO meant that Pixar would no longer have to be dependent on Disney to finance its movies. That was just the leverage Jobs wanted. "Because we now could fund half the cost of our movies, I could demand half the profits," he recalled. "But more important, I wanted co-branding." These were to be Pixar as well as Disney movies. Jobs flew down to have lunch with Eisner, who was stunned at his audacity. They had a 3-picture deal, and Pixar had made only one. Each side had its own nuclear weapons. After acrimony split with Eisner, Katzenberg had left Disney and become a co-founder with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen of DreamWorks SKG. If Eisner didn't agree to a new deal with Pixar, Jobs said, then Pixar could go to another studio, such as Katzenberg's. Once the 3-picture deal was done, in Eisner's hand was a threat that Disney could, if that happened, make its own sequel to Toy Story, using Woody and Buzz and all the characters that Lasseter had created. That would have been like molesting our children, Jobs later recalled. John started crying when he considered the possibility. So they hammered out a new arrangement. Eisner agreed to let Pixar put up half the money for the future films and in return take half the profits. He didn't think we could have many hits, so he thought he was saving himself some money, said Jobs. Ultimately, that was great for us because Pixar would have 10 blockbusters in a row. They also agreed on co-branding, though that took a lot of haggling to define. I took the position that it's a Disney movie, but eventually I relented, Eisner recalled. We start negotiating how big the letters in Disney are going to be and how big the letters in Pixar are going to be, just like 4-year-olds. But by the beginning of 1997, they had a deal for 5 films over the course of 10 years and even parted as friends, at least for the time being. Eisner was reasonable and fair to me then, Jobs later said, but eventually, over the course of a decade, I came to the conclusion that he was a dark man. In a letter to Pixar shareholders, Jobs explained that winning the right to have equal branding with Disney in all the movies as well as advertising and toys was the most important aspect of the deal. We want Pixar to grow into a brand that embodies the same level of trust as a Disney brand, he wrote. But in order for Pixar to earn this trust, consumers must know that Pixar is creating the films. Jobs was known during his career for creating great companies with valuable brands, and he created 2 of the best of the era, Apple and Pixar. I find this really interesting in terms of the partnership that began with Disney. It's a lot to know that Disney was using Pixar's computers in order to create their new things happening or their new graphics or whatever happening. But also, there's just so much happening here. Lasseter. Obviously, if you're like love Pixar characters as much as like the next person out there, Lasseter just, he intrigues me, but also like my heart goes to him. Like it's just the way that like Jobs says like if Disney had taken over Pixar characters, it would have been like molesting our children. You kind of have to agree with him because Disney has its own things now, but even back then it was just like it wasn't producing things as well as Pixar was. And Jobs kind of said a little bit about it in his sayings and things like that. He was saying, if Disney were to take over those characters, you shudder to think of what would have happened. Because they put out Cinderella 2. Have any of you heard of Cinderella 2? I mean, seriously, I barely knew it existed. And when I did eventually watch it, I saw snippets of it and I was like, oh my goodness, what is this? It totally is awful. And at the time when they were making Cinderella 2 is about the time when this feud is happening. So had they taken over those characters and they not had Lasseter and Jobs, 2 of the Lasseter being a perfectionist in his work, even though he's very easygoing and laughable and huggable, he is very much a perfectionist. I think we would have been telling a different story about Pixar, and that could have been very sad for all of us. I mean, who would know? I don't want to know. I don't want to think about it that way because I want to know that we're still going to have Cars and we're still going to have Monsters, Inc. And I'm just like, no. I'm glad that in the end, things ended up going well.